So, once more, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, particularly after the long weekend. Really appreciate you joining us. Today we're talking about maintaining safety, security and resilience during conflict. I think everyone will understand why we thought that was an important topic to cover at the moment. Before we start doing that, let's just do a couple of introductions. So first of all, myself, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Executive Chairman of Insignia. We're a specialist crisis management consultancy. We work with leaders of businesses around the world to help them do and say the right things on the most challenging days of their business lives, and many of them are having very challenging days at the moment. I'm really pleased to be joined by Chris Holt, who is a long-time friend and associate of Insignia. He was a speaker at our conference last year, and his expertise will be perfectly suited to what we're talking about this afternoon. Chris, maybe if you could say a few words about who you are and your background, please.
Of course. You can hear me okay, I hope, Jonathan.
Coming through loud and clear.
So thank you very much for having me along again. It's always a pleasure to speak with you on Insignia events. So I had an initial career in the military, you can see from the ego wall, including some time in the Middle East, but then in 2008 joined the Lloyd's and London insurance market, working in the kind of crisis management or malicious risks space. And that's included throughout that time working on a range of evacuations, both political and non-political. But I suppose working in that area of hostile environment or complex environment, business travel and personal accident, and also in the weeds of kidnapped for ransom, which I mentioned because it has a political evacuation clause in there. So I've spent the last 18 years or so working in that area, and now offer independent advice in that regard. But I'm very happy to be here. I know there are some equally well-experienced people on the call, which would be interesting. I'm looking forward to some questions at the end.
Excellent. So in terms of the format for everyone, Chris and I are going to have a chat about primarily how to keep people safe in a conflict situation, or equally a natural disaster. We're also going to talk a little bit about maintaining business and maintaining reputation, but the key focus today is going to be about people. We will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. Those can be fed through via the chat box on your control panel on the right-hand side. So please feel free to post questions as we go through, but we'll cover those in the final few minutes of the webinar. So moving on, some context setting first of all. Clearly, we've talked about relocation and evacuation, particularly with regards to the current situation in the Middle East. But Chris, maybe if we look a little bit more broadly, first of all, what are some of the most common causes of an evacuation or a relocation of your people?
Yeah, and I think it's important, Jonathan, to make clear that I don't think we're proposing to talk in detail about what's happening at the moment in the Middle East. This is broadly around those issues that can occur. So I'm going to lump it into three areas, really. So political evacuation, where we have something like we've seen at the moment. And I would say over the last 15 years or so, we've seen a number of those types of political evacuation. Perhaps some organizations, when Russia invaded Ukraine, decided they wished to evacuate from Russia. We had those incidents that occurred, perhaps the wrong phrase, but the issues that happened around the Middle East in around 2011. We all know what that looks and feels like. It's a political event where organizations wish to normally leave a region. Non-political evacuation, which I would split between a natural catastrophe, so a windstorm, a tsunami, a volcano, I was stuck in India when we had the unpronounceable Icelandic volcano that erupted. So we all again know what that looks like, and that tends to be regional. But then on that non-political side, also the man-made catastrophe. So some kind of industrial incident, so non-political, but something where we might have, for example, a leak from a manufacturing plant or similar. The final thing I would say, and I think is probably most common just in terms of evacuation, so not at scale, is medical. So, you know, if you speak to the responders that work in this area, the routine work that goes on day in, day out is evacuation and repatriation of individuals who've either hurt themselves or have had a medical emergency. And I think there's a lot to learn from those kind of routine or semi-routine medical evacuations. So political, non-political, nat cat, man-made cat, and then medical evacuation. We talked about this obviously in advance of this call, and I think there's a real difference there between something which is systemic, so affecting everyone, versus the type of evacuations where they're either client or brand specific. I mentioned Russia, so when that occurred, we were supporting some institutions with leaving Russia, whereas other organizations from other countries were very happy to stay. So there was a kind of bifurcation of organizational appetite. I think there can be that similar split around nationalities of travelers or individuals, which can create questions around duty of care and the duty of care that's owned. Or there can be other factors which mean that it isn't necessarily a systemic evacuation. You know, everyone who is broadly an expat is looking to leave a particular area, but it can be that there is a selective appetite either by organisation, nationality, or something else. And I think that's where it gets more complicated for an organisation's crisis management team to decide what they're going to do.
And on this call, we've got a wide range of organisations and sectors. Just looking down here, we've got representatives from financial services, travel, transport, professional services, pharma, media, infrastructure, tech, retail, manufacturing, energy, and telecoms. Are there a set of kind of consistent principles across all sectors, or does it vary from either sector to sector or organisation to organisation when you're thinking about getting people out of a country or a region?
I think the processes are broadly the same, and we might talk in a moment about some of those building blocks that occur. And I think, you know, if you look at some of the guidance that's out there, whether that's ISO 3130, which is the international standard on safe travel, which I actually think is a really good document, or if you look at either what the UK government or US government publishes, so that OSAC have got a kind of guide around this, or indeed what insurance brokers or insurers publish, there is consistency, I think, around what makes sense from a building block perspective. But I think the context of organisation, which I think is hinted at very strongly in your question, ultimately is hugely important. So, you know, I've mentioned to you that I provide advice to a news organisation, and, you know, while many organisations have been seeking to leave certain parts of the Middle East, those organisations are looking to go. So I think their organisational context is fundamentally different. And I think if you were to look at the risk appetite, risk tolerance, and actually the expectation of key stakeholder groups for different organisations, it does mean that the plans need to be nuanced and different. So an NGO will have a very different risk appetite in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa than perhaps a consultancy firm might if there is a kind of low-level regional problem. And I think whilst the building blocks, the logic, and importantly the best practice remains the same, the approach does need to be nuanced based on the lens through which an organisation looks at that. And I think the area where I see most difference is in how people view the duty of care they owe to their people and the different types of people. So, understanding the level of duty of care an organisation may wish to afford its travellers versus perhaps its in-country expats versus its local nationals is nuanced, and it depends often on the nature of the event which is causing the evacuation, whether it's political, non-political, but it also depends on the specific context of that organisation. But I would say understanding at senior leadership level, or in fact organisational level, what an organisation, what the organisation's position is on duty of care, I think is a very important first building block.
So a couple of comments on that. Firstly, I completely endorse. Of course, it does have to be nuanced, and one of the things in your crisis management planning is to consider this among the risks that you may face, and what would be the principles that you would apply. What is your risk tolerance, and also, as always in a crisis, what do your values imply in terms of how would you respond? What would you do? How would you care for your people? And talking of care, this phrase duty of care, and it's more than a phrase, but duty of care is something that is intrinsic to how you look after your people. But can you talk to us a little bit more, Chris, about what that actually means from a legal and from a practical point of view?
Sure. I'm not a lawyer, for those. I think there may be someone on the call, but we'll have a go. I think it depends on where the organisation is. I'm going to start with the UK, given that's where we're both sat. So the initial test, which I think is very helpful for crisis management teams to consider, is the House of Lords tripartite test on duty of care, which broadly provides kind of three factors to consider. So the first factor is reasonable foreseeability. So was the risk reasonably foreseeable? I think at UK law, if something genuinely unexpected occurs, then there is an acceptance that is genuinely unexpected. But there is now very strong case law, for example, around acts of terrorism or similar, which says that is a reasonably foreseeable risk. And if you as an organisation are sending people to a complex environment where these risks do manifest, then you can't just say, oh, we didn't really expect it. That's not going to cut it. So the first test is one of reasonable foreseeability. The second test is around proximity. So is there a requisite degree of proximity between the person who's been injured or hurt or negatively affected and the organisation? And I think if you are employing that individual or in some way tasking them, there is a sufficiently proximate relationship. And the detail here is often around issues like subcontractors, where they might be required, for example, to buy their own insurance if they are traveling to a particular country. That, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but that requirement for them to buy their own insurance doesn't abrogate the organisation of the responsibility to understand what the risks are before they send someone who is a contractor into a particular environment. There is a requisite degree of proximity that already exists. Those two are really the key two, I think, for crisis management teams and indeed boards to understand, which is this idea of reasonable foreseeability and proximate relationship. The third one is broadly around whether it's fair, just and reasonable. And this is the concept that the duty won't be imposed if there's a kind of an expansion of liability beyond what's good for society. And I think that's often the one that boards get wrapped around, which is, well, no, this is probably not great for us. But it's my guidance is always, look, if it's a reasonably foreseeable risk and you're instructing that person to be there, you owe them a duty of care. Now there is a degree to which, and US law is nuanced and slightly different. I think the California law is actually quite helpful. Each state has a slightly different view on a duty of care, but California law is useful. But there is this specific kind of inclusion of what is the market norms. And I think that comes back to the nature of the organisation and therefore the nature of the risk that's been taken. So, for example, a news media organisation you know, going into a complex environment to gather news will be viewed through the lens of what is normal and reasonable for that activity, whereas a consultancy firm, which might be able to choose to conduct its work a different way, you know, we're back to kind of health and safety at work 1974 type approaches here. If you can conduct the work a different way, for example through a Teams call, then you ought to be considering that. So reasonably foreseeable, proximate relationship, and then really the next one is, and what is normal in our sector.
Great. So I think that sets us up nicely for talking about what prudent planning ahead of the event kind of looks like. And maybe I'll just give a very brief overview before handing over to the kind of true expert in this area, Chris. But I just want to apply, I think, 3 broader crisis management principles to planning for the kinds of events that we're talking about. And the first is to be open to conceiving of the worst case. Of course, we hope that natural disasters don't occur. Of course, we hope that conflict is avoided, but being ready to evacuate your people out of a challenging country or region should be part of your crisis management planning. So the first thing to say is, in your risk assessments, do plan for the worst case scenarios. Second thing is, make sure that your broader crisis management plans are risk agnostic, so that if you're going to form your crisis management team in the event of the kind of situation that we're facing at the moment, the plan needs to be capable of guiding that team through purposeful decision making, whatever the situation is. And the third thing is doing some, and we'll touch on this in more detail in a couple of minutes, but doing that thinking and scenario planning beforehand. If we were to have to evacuate or relocate, who would we expect to evacuate, relocate? How would we do that? Who would make the decision? So a realistic worst case risk assessment, a risk agnostic crisis management plan that can guide your leaders through that decision making process, and some scenario planning beforehand. But Chris, if we now kind of focus specifically on additional planning beyond the normal crisis management planning that organizations should do, what would you be advising or suggesting is either best practice or, you know, the absolute minimum that organizations should be thinking about?
Well, I agree with you to start with around kind of risk agnostic planning. In fact, everything that you've just said. So integrate plans where you possibly can. Have them so they're risk agnostic around what the responses are, rather than what the kind of specificity of the scenario. I spoke to, so as you know, part of the reason that we're doing this is I've been kind of involved with providing some advice to a number of boards who are navigating what's happened in the last 4 weeks or so. And prior to coming on, I thought I'd give a call to a couple of the vendors who've actually done the heavy lifting, if you like, just around what the plans were. And I think I would describe, before I talk about the kind of planning, I would describe the outcome of those discussions is in the difficult box, which is what both of the vendors identified was that actually there isn't anything complex here. It's about doing the basics well. And I think for organizations that can actually be quite challenging. You know, in an environment where change at the moment is around, okay, how can we leverage AI, or what can we do around data integration that helps, or where can we get efficiencies? The message which is, no, this is about having a project manager who you can rely to get on with something, who's got a phone and a spreadsheet and can actually just sit on this and make it work, can be an answer which is outside of what we're normally hearing. But the consistent 3 themes from speaking to those vendors before I talk about the planning is around understanding the manifest. So who is in a particular region at a particular time. I won't go into details, but across a number of organizations I've worked with as well, just the kind of the way that life works is that people have boyfriends or girlfriends staying with them that might not be disclosed on a manifest. People have children who are mobile and might be in or out depending on what's going on at a particular time. Some people might have family members who are staying with them. Equally, a number of organizations who are planning to evacuate, X number of people that they know are on their manifest found that some of those people had already self-evacuated and they didn't need to plan for them. So the first thing would be kind of know your manifest, know who's on the ground, which is kind of a basics done well thing. Second point from both really was around early activation of a crisis management team, so that the organization does have a single focal point through which everything and anything to do with, are we evacuating, are we sheltering in place, I'm about to go on holiday, can I go on holiday and then not come back? Any of those issues, let's ensure there's a single focal point. And the final point was really around communication, and one of those individuals just basically said communicate. So his experience was that those organizations that were rapidly creating WhatsApp groups for groups of people who are evacuating chucked in a relevant project manager from the organization, threw in a project manager from the vendor that was evacuating them, and somebody from the crisis management team who could then update leadership on progress, tended to get on better than those that relied on overly complex call trees. So yeah, basics done well is the first thing I would say in the plan, which is not always consistent with what's going on elsewhere in our businesses. I think consistent with that, I would say the plan doesn't need to be overly complex. I think it does help for leadership to have already considered what their position is on differences in duty of care based on people. So it is not unusual to evacuate, let's say, travelers first, have a plan to deal with expats, but to expect that you're going to leave local nationals on the ground. Those three groups are all employees. You owe them all a duty of care, but during the making of a plan, I think it's key that leadership team is comfortable and understands the organizational appetite around different aspects of duty of care based on different groups of people. That would be thing one. I think it does help in producing a plan to consider the lens through which the organization is also going to look at the other assets that it has. And okay, so things and stuff, vehicles and physical assets is easy. I think relationships, particularly with key clients in a region, is much more nuanced. And I know you talk about this. So, if, for example, using what's just happened, if a significant part of your organization's revenue comes from a single key relationship in that region, is it really great for your organization if at the first whiff of trouble you're going to run away? So what is the value of that relationship, and what is the risk tolerance of the organization to protect that relationship, and who are the key people? So I think that's got to be in the plan somewhere. And along with the lens through which you consider other assets, I think stuff isn't really a worry for most people or businesses, but information is. And even in a digital age, it's amazing when you actually ask an organization, do you have any physical information in your offices? Are there any printed off copies of highly sensitive information around either your commercial relationships, your products, intellectual property? It's amazing how often people say, yes, we do have physical information, or we do have a server on site that has information. So I think that's probably key. And then the third piece, so leadership familiar with duty of care around people. What's your decision there? Capturing what the assets are in a particular country, so you know what you want to protect. And then probably the third piece is around those key third-party relationships, just knowing who they are and having them on a call sheet. So the insurance list, i.e., what is your business travel and personal accident insurance policy? Is there a different policy for war risk countries than there is for normal countries? Do they have different responders? They normally do. So then, who are the insured responders? What are the phone numbers? What are the services that they are on the hook for, if you like. So what can I expect to pick the phone up for and get? Do I have other responders that are not insured? So do we have a relationship existing with a security company or a company that does evacuation, or with someone like an international SOS who provides our medical services? And then finally, I think in that plan as well is who are the third parties that we're going to trust around information? We might talk about that in a moment, but who are we going to believe if there is a contested information environment around what's actually happening? So that for me is the basics of the plan, and we might talk in a moment about some of the scenarios or some of the key components. But I think in a time where it's very difficult to get leadership time, those three things: what do we think about our people? What are the assets that we're going to protect? And who's going to help us solve if we have a nightmare problem?
And again, that third one, I mean, we're talking about prudent planning. It's so important to know that in advance. I mean, even relatively simple things you were saying about your insurance policy, really understanding what that covers, what it mandates, what it requires, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, what level of support you can expect. Again, it's like good crisis management in any context. You want to have to do the minimum amount of work in the crisis that could have been done before the crisis. So yeah, knowing those requirements, and again, knowing who your key advisors are going to be. If it's you talked about the different reasons for relocation and evacuation at the start. If it's something very specific to your organization, you will get your A team of advisors. If it's a situation that's affecting multiple organizations, advisors could be in short supply, because everybody wants their support.
Yeah, and just briefly before you go on to the next question, one thing I should have said around the insurance piece, because it is really, this is probably the one that fascinates me most. So, and it's for very understandable reasons. So those organizations that purchase a kidnap for ransom policy, I do think kidnap for ransom is probably the worst named insurance product in the kind of milieu of insurance out there. But one of the things that tends to be in most grown-up policies is a political evacuation clause. So many of the organizations that will have evacuated some people from the Middle East over the last number of weeks will have done so net account. That will have been on balance sheet. Many of them won't have activated the insurance clause for political evacuation that they pay money for, because they don't know that it's there. And I think as a kind of takeaway, which is a really important one, is do check your K&R policy. If it's got a political evacuation clause and a political evacuation is required, you pay for insurance for a reason. Activate your policy.
Good advice. Good advice. Let's move on to something we both touched on already, which is scenario planning. Obviously, when we're particularly talking about geopolitical risk, it can be, I guess, kind of hard to know what to scenario plan for. So how do you do the right kind of and the right amount of scenario planning for risks of that kind, Chris?
Yeah, and again, we're going to be at risk of agreeing with each other, but I'll try and create some difference. I think most organizations don't have an internal team that constantly does geopolitical contingency planning with a high level of detail. You wouldn't expect them to, and I think therefore this isn't about organizations being able to predict the future, and it's only sensible to do scenario planning if you come up with really plausible stuff that the FCDO would think is credible. I don't think that's the point for me, and I know it's a kind of cliche, but Eisenhower's quote, which is and I'll ruin it, but it's along the lines of, in preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So really the scenario planning piece here is not around getting to the right answer, and if you don't get the right answer, there's no point. For me, this is around coming up with credible, plausible scenarios that stress test for your crisis management team and senior leaders. Okay, that's interesting. What would we want to do in that circumstance? Let's capture that and have that as a component of our plan. So we've already gone there in terms of thinking about it, and then we can come back with a suite of responses and measures that have already been produced that allowed us to kind of, like a smorgasbord, pick and say, well, okay, well, this one, whatever the scenario is, and I'll go back to what you said earlier, I'm a great fan of plans that are scenario agnostic. So I'm not really worried about whether we need to leave this country because there's been a coup, or because the nuclear power stations had a moment, or because there is a pandemic of some type. What I'm interested in is, if I need to leave the country, what are the key things for me in terms of people, assets, relationships, you know, that type of thing. But I think it is worth having a range of scenarios in terms of severity. So at either end of that, I think it is worth stress testing a scenario plan at very worst case. You know, a flash bang, we've gone from a normal operating environment to a really challenging operating environment, like, for whatever reason. Okay, how are we going to manage that? I think that kind of has to be in your scenario planning. And at the opposite end, I think it's very helpful to have a kind of creeping incremental, are we at the point yet where we're going to initiate our crisis management team? Okay, this has happened. What about now? Is this a crisis yet, or is it not a crisis? And I think, having been to a number of your events, those kind of creeping scenarios can often be much more challenging for organizations than a flashbang and we're in it. Clearly, we're initiating our crisis management team and we're going with an evacuation plan. So I think almost having that, and you need to look at that scenario, but having a creeping incremental what about now type scenario is hugely helpful.
So to violently agree again, yes, those creeping crises are frequently the hardest to manage, because you don't notice that they're slowly getting worse, and the situation today is actually very different to the situation 7, 30 or 60 days ago. And that's why, again, it comes back to planning in advance rather than having to have your antenna finely tuned at the time, which is important. But in addition, setting some criteria or triggers in advance, which would constitute a situation whereby you needed to do A, B, or C as it relates to relocation or evacuation. Don't wait for the crisis to have to make those decisions. Okay, everyone, we're about halfway through. Do please post your questions. I see we have a couple already, but we will save 10 minutes at the end to answer queries you may have. And Chris, moving on through this discussion, you touched on a few minutes ago the importance of trusted advisors and reliable information sources. And we know that in any crisis, often high quality information is in short supply, and there's much speculation, rumor, mis and disinformation. What are your tips and guidelines in the kinds of situations we're talking about? Who should we turn to for trusted advice?
I'm going to try and bridge from something you just said actually into this. So I think UK government, to start with, has got a disproportionately important role for all nationalities, because many of the global insurers of business travel and personal accident use the FCDO travel site as an indicator of whether they'll provide cover or not. And if a country which is, you know, green for travel becomes red, that is often referenced in an insurance policy. And just to be really clear, I am not providing any insurance advice here, just for everyone to consider. But, you know, that will often be the trigger. I think as well, there are other things that the UK government publishes which are helpful. Just tracking back to what we were talking about with the kind of creeping incremental increase in risk. There's actually quite a useful document if people are boring on this, which I am incredibly boring on this, which is the non-combatant evacuation operations guide, which our UK military publishes, which is, okay, if we are in that extreme scenario and everything else fails, how do you get out? Well, you wait for a grey ship or a grey aircraft. But they talk about this idea of the evacuation paradox. So this idea that as the risk in an environment, whatever the driver of the risk, increases, people also want to leave. But there is this strange period where people will dig in because they've committed to be there. So the risk continues to increase, but there is this paradoxical moment where the desire to leave runs contrary to the increase in risk. And that's a really dangerous period. You know, whatever the issue which is causing the risk exposure. That's why I think a crisis management team knowing, well, if we get to here, our organizational risk appetite is we want everyone out. It takes the decision away from those that are on the ground. Anyway, it's not the question you asked, but it came to me while you were speaking. So I think FCDO travel is a really good start point around country risk information. Okay, it's formulaic. It tends to move incrementally and slowly because it does have that relationship to the insurance markets. And I know, having spoken over the years to a number of the people that have been on that team, they are very aware of their responsibilities to move incrementally and not be, you know, volatile with what they're doing. I think US state, state.travel is also a good kind of resection of information. I think one needs to be aware that with both of those organizations, there can be a political angle, inevitably. You know, allies might be scored differently to people who are adversaries, for example. But broadly speaking, I think FCDO and State Department are good. I always recommend that people complement that information with whoever their partners are. So most of the insurers who provide business travel and personal accident will have a relationship with a third party, and those third parties almost always provide some kind of country risk information alongside a business travel policy. So, you know, having someone in the organization that's able to triangulate broadly public sector information with broadly commercial information, I always think is a useful thing to do. And then if there are people on the ground or people who you know are, and we talked about those relationships earlier, do you have a non-insured relationship with a security provider? Or indeed, if you're operating in a particular environment, who are your third parties that you work with, who you trust, who might have local situational awareness that can allow you to finesse the information that you're getting from FCDO or state or your insurers, you know, to allow you to make a decision about what's happening. And I think you're, you know, on the money that when these things happen, you do tend to have conflicting information. And sometimes organizations do find themselves in a position where there is great uncertainty, and the solution is often to be risk averse. That's where people end up going, rather than, you know, in a mixture of information, some of which says, no, you know, the FCDO is saying we want you to go, but your local partner is saying it's absolutely safe. It's not unusual that organizations will say FCDO is what drives our travel insurance. We're very sorry, we're going to go. That kind of ends up being not an unusual circumstance for those organizations that would be expected to respond to FCDO type advice.
Thank you. So if we perhaps now move into what some of the practical options are for keeping your people safe during either a natural disaster or conflict, what is that kind of almost sliding scale of options for in-country employees and other people?
So inevitably, this is going to verge into being a bit listy, but I do want to talk through, and in doing this, because I knew we would discuss this, Jonathan, I've gone and looked at the kind of the best practices that are out there that exist, if you like. So if you look at ISO 3130, or if you look at there is a good OSAC document from the US government. It's kind of old, but if I'm honest, the advice in it has stood the test of time pretty well. But if you then also look at the guidance which is issued by the range of insurers and insurance intermediaries and response organisations, the language is broadly consistent. So forgive me if it's in some way listy, but I'll go through in kind of probably an incremental fashion. At the lowest end, you've got kind of a heightened alert or restricted operations. Broadly speaking, this is where organisations keep what they're doing, but they don't increase risk. And you might expect to see kind of lockdowns for locally employed, for expat employed civilians, or for, a curfew or reduced public footprint. So if we happen to fly flags outside of our offices, maybe we don't fly the flags, or we take our brand down. So that's restricted operations. Drawdown is broadly a planned reduction of non-essential personnel over time. Other plans call this kind of phased evacuation, and that might be specific groups or locations. So you decide that actually these locations that are outside of the capital city or in a region, actually we're gonna phase an evacuation from there. So we're going to draw down in those areas. Assisted departure is kind of similar, but that tends to also involve helping family members leave. So it's a kind of drawdown, but then assisting with the departure of those people who are related to employees, tends to be expat employees. And then related to both of those, you hear the term consolidation used. So that is where we might bring dispersed operations together into a single site. So really it just allows you more agility if circumstances change. You've got everyone together and you aren't having to move people from one place to the other. So I'm going to pause there because I've got another 4 or 5 to go to, and I don't want to be too listy, but broadly speaking, if there was a kind of incremental deterioration, slow deterioration, those are the things that you might expect to see done early. Does that make sense so far, Jonathan?
Just to mute myself, yes, it absolutely does. And actually, maybe as you go through the next levels, I'm not sure whether you're able to answer the question I'm about to put, but if you are, it'd be great. What are you seeing or hearing with regards to what organisations have done with regards to the current situation?
Yeah, okay. So, well, actually, it's well timed because the next one is a partial evacuation. So partial evacuation is normally when the core team remains, but the peripheral team members tends to be expats, and anyone who's travelling in country is evacuated. But the core team that are there to manage a relationship with key stakeholders and the local nationals will remain in place. And I think that, interestingly, so of the organisations that I've spoken with the boards of, and those that I'm aware of through third parties where I've chatted, there was a very effective initial phase. And actually, I have to say, I think the insurance industry and its appointed responders are actually really good at doing this in a quiet and effective way. I don't know if there's anyone from the FCDO on. Please, if there is, please don't take this as a criticism. But the FCDO quite rightly trumpets when it evacuates people using British resources, and quite rightly so. If you ask the insured responders and or the non-insured responders the kind of numbers that they're dealing with, I think we have to tip our hat slightly and say this industry, much of which is based in the UK, is extremely good at getting people out of a region quickly. I've seen a lot of partial evacuation, and currently I'm seeing a number of people going back into country. So there's been a kind of initial partial evacuation, leaving core team and local nationals to run it. And then we're a number of weeks on, I'm actually seeing a number of executives who are going back in to demonstrate commitment to relationship, which we talked about earlier. next up from there, I think we would go with a full evacuation, that is normally, and the OSEC plan is actually quite good on this. So that's a planned full evacuation rather than a kind of a flashbang. It's kind of conducted in a planned way, a transition to remote presence only, the ability to, in a planned way, take a senior local national employee and go and hand over strategic relationships to ensure that information or assets have been pulled out, that type of thing. I've only got 2 left. Obviously, after a full evacuation is an emergency evacuation, which is, you know, rapid and under deteriorating circumstances, and we've seen a number of those. And then the final one, which is kind of the really worst case, is a non-combatant evacuation operation, or a NEO, which is actually the industry which does this for a living. Even they can't actually get in, and we are reliant on nation states to, you know, come with men in green with guns and grey aeroplanes and ships and affect an evacuation of non-combatants. And I think, broadly speaking, if you're in that realm, then that kind of is in the area where people just expect you to do the best you can, because you're in a force majeure type moment, and you've just got to try and collaborate as much as you can with the government forces that are there. So there you go. That's the kind of escalating list. My apologies that it's a bit listy, but I think it's worth going through of what the normal names and expected responses are.
That's great. I can see we have 3 questions already, so maybe we'll just canter through the next slide to leave 10 minutes for those 3 questions and to sum up. But we've talked clearly a lot about people, because people are the most important factor in any crisis. But yeah, what else might need to be protected in the kinds of situations that we're talking about?
So we have touched on this, so I'll keep it brief so we do get some time for questions. I think the kind of relationships and reputation, and again, having attended a number of your events, I know you're very strong on this, and quite rightly so. I think if you're, you know, a broadly Western, I don't really like that term, but let's roll with it. If you're a broadly Western business, you're operating in a complex environment, and there is some kind of a political wobble in that environment. You know, if you and your organization at the first whiff of disharmony leave en masse, then I think quite reasonably your local partners may not be entirely impressed with that. So I think there is this requirement for senior leaders to understand what the reputational factors are in a region where you're operating, and who the key relationships are, often by having a discussion with key local stakeholders and explaining the difficulty and the nuance of the problem that you as an organization are facing. Often explaining that can be helpful, not always, but often it can be helpful to say that we're actually under a bit of pressure here. You know, we really value the relationship. We want to make sure that we are doing the right thing for us. You know, is there anything we can do to support you? It's also a difficult time for you, I know, but I think that's much better, planning that kind of the nuance of the relationship and the reputation piece, rather than purely affecting an operational plan, getting your people out and then picking up the phone to your local partner saying, oh no, we're out, by the way, we've gone. And before I go on to the next ones, I'm actually going to ask your opinion on that, because you're very strong on this. I've heard you talk about this before around that reputational piece.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the key things that you're trying to preserve in a crisis is trust and confidence, and that's clearly primarily trust and confidence amongst your own people, but it is the trust and confidence of all your other stakeholders as well. And you know, we obviously do hope and pray that all crises come to an end eventually, and you want to then return to those relationships with your reputation intact and with the trust and confidence of your key stakeholders. And we know that any crisis is an inflection point for an organization, and if you behave and perform well in the crisis, you will maintain those relationships. If you play fast and loose and are very pragmatic or self-serving, that will not be the case. So yeah, sadly for the benefit of a volatile and explosive webinar, I'm completely agreeing with you once more, Chris.
Well, look, there's the other things that might need to be protected, and we've talked about them a bit, and I'll close off quickly for you. The kind of second one really is assets. You know, as I've said, people don't really worry about stuff when this is going on. Quite reasonably, that's what insurance is for. But I do think information is something that needs to be thought about well in advance. So it's amazing how often physical information is left in an office or an operating environment, which can subsequently prove to be quite embarrassing because reputationally it doesn't demonstrate that you've thought this through and you've acted coherently. If you're leaving intellectual property somewhere that somebody then finds, and I think there is just a fine detail point there around data, which is that it is interesting based on regional offices how often there is an agreement about where the data sits at rest, and you can assume that the whole system is in the cloud and in your AWS servers, and you've said they're going to be in whatever country they're going to be in. But it is interesting how often there is data locally stored, which again can be awkward. And then the final, so people relationship was the first one, then the kind of stuff. But the final thing I would say is around this operational piece, which is that business continuity management colleagues are brilliant at this and are brilliant at producing highly detailed plans that explain how the organization can flip operations or components of operations to other countries or to be remote or whatever. And I think quite reasonably, those business continuity management colleagues can be extraordinarily frustrated when a senior leadership professional comes into a crisis management team and starts hot planning how business continuity management is going to work on first principles based on the fact that they're in charge of the CMT. So I think I would say that from an operational perspective, engaging early with BCM colleagues who are likely to have highly sophisticated plans for the continuation of operations when these things happen is an absolute must.
Fabulous. Right, I'm going to move us on to questions for the final 7 or 8 minutes. The first question, Chris, is from Sue. What is your view on extraction organisations? Do you think there is a risk of a false sense of security, particularly in instances where mass extraction is required involving many organisations and locations?
Yeah. Thank you, Sue. It's a really broad question and one that I could be very direct on. So I think we're quite lucky in the UK that we have a number of organisations that do this for a living. And I think that the first thing to say is when something like what's just happened in the Gulf occurs, it is remarkable how many organisations pop their head above the parapet and say that they are available to do this type of activity. So I think there is an initial process of due diligence to be done. And in my opinion, the time to do the due diligence is not when the event has occurred, because there's a paucity of time. It's to decide on who you want to work with beforehand. And I think that due diligence just needs to follow the process you would expect with anything else. Who they are insured by is actually a good test of the organizations, but also scale and regions that they operate in. And if they do have a retained relationship with an insurer, that tends to be a good indication that they are a credible organization at scale, which is past due diligence of people that know what they're talking about. That's the kind of first thing around my view on those organizations. I think there is, and Sue, I think it's a really valid point to make around sometimes the false sense of security that one can get if there is a large systemic event and everyone needs to come out of a particular area at the same time. Back in 2011, when we had a kind of congestion of, a contagion, excuse me, a contagion of events across North Africa and then into the Middle East. There were one or two very large, very well-known organisations that teetered on the edge of calling for force majeure, which of course is really very unhelpful if you've relied on them in your plan. But there is a certain amount of just straightforward logic here, which is that most organizations don't want to keep huge amounts of resource sat around doing nothing. So they hold lists of organizations they can call on when it gets busy. And often the point at which the plan is tested, so this large evacuation organization, this large evacuation organization, and this one all have the contact deals of small local company, which has got, 3 buses. The only point often that gets tested is when they all pick up the phone. So I would say, and I do this with a number of the organizations who have higher risk exposures, having multiple vendor relationships. So maybe a relationship on your normal business travel and accident, a relationship via your hostile environment policy, and then having a non-insured relationship at least gives you choice, so that you can pick up the phone to 3 pre-vetted organizations and say, this one's failed, or we're not getting through. What have you guys got on the ground? I hope that answers the question, Sue and Jonathan.
Yeah, and I mean, it's contingency planning for your contingency planning, isn't it? Which makes good sense. So question from Christina: what should crisis management execs consider throughout evacuation scenarios to be able to defend their decision making? I mean, I'll give you a couple of thoughts first of all before throwing it over to Chris. One, again, I think by doing good planning ahead of time and having thought through some of those key decisions and, really understood why you are making those decisions or why you would make those decisions, that helps. Clearly, the fundamental basic best practice of logging the rationale for that decision makes them defensible. And thirdly, I think leaders having the courage, values, and ethics to actually make good decisions based on what is right, not just on what is written in the book or what might be strictly legally correct. But that's my 4 pence. Chris, what would your perspective be?
Knowingly, we're going to agree, and I know we're coming up against time. Christina, I think this comes down to having a plan for senior executives on how you're going to make decisions, and you can call it the OODA loop if you want to, so observe, orientate, decide, act, or it's the MOD, forgive me if there's anyone on, observe, overreact, deny accountability, and apportion blame. But, that kind of process where you gather information, you decide what the context is for your organization, you make a decision, and then you act. If you follow that cycle, you're most likely to make logical decisions. And I would agree with Jonathan that contemporaneous notes that allow you as a board to demonstrate what you thought was happening when you made the decision, even if subsequently the facts change. If you made, sadly, I've been involved in a number of court cases in the UK around duty of care, particularly with terrorism. And if you can demonstrate that you made a sensible decision based on the information available to you at the time, even if subsequently the information was different, then you're in good shape. So having the cycle, recording what you knew at the time, that's the way to ensure that you are defensible.
Chris, thank you. We always promise to finish on time. There are a couple of questions we haven't been able to cover, but I think that's also partly because there was hopefully so many insights and rich information within the webinar. So thank you everyone for joining us. Chris, thank you to you in particular. At times like these, we've talked to ourselves about how important it is to have the right information and the right advisors. And I'm really grateful to you for sharing your insight, expertise and knowledge, because I think everyone on this call would agree that it's been really, really valuable. It's a shame that we need the expertise right now, but we certainly do. So for those of you on the call, thank you for joining us. There will be an email with a recording of this session and contact details coming out to you in the next 24 hours. I know that Chris would be happy to receive emails with further questions if you have them. Likewise, here are my contact details. But for now, once more, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Chris. And I wish everyone a safe and crisis-free afternoon. Many thanks, everyone.